Ladies and gentlemen, how are you doing? This is myself, Steph, here with Tom Rousel from Survive the Jive, and I am here to discuss various things about the recent innovations in genetics. This man actually has been quite an educator for me in this topic. I've been following lots of his videos. I recommend you check out his channel. It's a fantastic one. And I guess the general thesis that I've gathered is that right now we're going through a little bit of a golden age. This is not something people notice, but it's happening in the background, you know. And just like AI is obviously charging forward, the advancements in science are going in many different directions, and one of them is in the realm of genetics. We are actually getting into our own flesh, and we're discovering very interesting things about our past. I think this is relevant for many reasons. One of them is because we've obviously constructed a story of ourselves, you know, our myths and our history. And interestingly, our genetics are revealing that our history is even deeper than we might think. It's revealing things that we couldn't have possibly guessed. And this man I've brought on today is actually an expert in this, and he's got some very fascinating stories to tell. So I've loads of things here I want to ask this gentleman, but I will let him introduce himself. I don't know, what do you think about my intro? Do you think this is a good intro? Have I set it up? Do you think this is accurate about what's going on? Represents you.
Sounds good to me, Steph. Thanks very much for having me on. I'm a fan of your channel. Got some great insights you're dropping on Twitter sometimes, and I enjoy the videos as well. So I was professionally, I was working in media. I used to be a journalist, a writer, fashion and music and stuff like that. My first degree was in communication, so I learned a bit of filmmaking and also journalism there. Second degree, I went back to and I studied medieval history, but focusing on like Anglo-Saxon paganism and the process of conversion and Vikings and stuff like that. But then since then, in the last 12 years, I've been studying history going back, and I've become much more interested in archaeology. And especially since 2015, 2016, something happened you just touched on called the genomic revolution. So basically, genetic science has been used in the study of history since the 90s, but it was clunky and unreliable up until in the old days. It was very expensive, and there was always a risk of contamination from the researchers getting their DNA mixed up with that of the subjects. So they'd be spending thousands and thousands to look at a tiny bit of one skeleton's genome, and then the results weren't reliable. So they all made headlines back in the 90s and early 2000s, but a lot of experts would be like, come on, we can't rewrite everything in history based on this flimsy evidence. But what a lot of people didn't realize is that archaeogenetics since 2016 is a completely different thing. It's much cheaper. It's much more efficient. We've got thousands and thousands of sampled skeletons now from different periods. So it's not just one, and each one can be genome wide in some cases, depending on the coverage of the skeleton in question, how old it is. They get a lot of coverage, and there's very, very little risk of contamination. So we're in a completely different ballgame. We've opened up the floodgates to this whole wealth of information about the past that no one ever knew there would be. And the geneticists are just sort of, boffins looking at the data and publishing it. And they didn't realize, boffins, but they didn't know that they were going to offend the academy so much and cause so much controversy, because so much of the stuff that has been discovered reaffirms the claims of 19th century anthropologists who have been labeled colonialist, racists and stuff like that in recent times. It reaffirms some of the claims by medieval historians talking about events in the British Isles in medieval times. And it reaffirms even the claims of ancient historians like Tacitus and Herodotus, the first ever historian, who were making all kinds of claims about the anthropological observations about peoples around the world at that time, which most experts have said, oh, this is just gibberish nonsense. But now many of those claims have been proven thanks to this new science. So it's also debunking many things that people have liked to believe that it turns out are rubbish. So it's simultaneously getting rid of the nonsense that we've accumulated from, sort of semi-legendary ideas about the past, but also reaffirming some legends as well.
So the first thing that actually got me into all this, well, not got me into it, I've been following your channel for a long time and kind of gradually gathering the information, but it is very, very complex, a lot of it, and it's very, very difficult to wrap your head around. So a major thing I want to do with you today is actually run you through what I know, and then you're probably going to correct me an awful lot, because I think my process of discovery has been the beginner one in its essence. And I've come up across many of the assumptions, the mistakes and all this. So I went into it because I was looking for the story of Ireland. Obviously, my self-interest, my selfishness leads me there. And of course, you're the story of Britain, and you actually know a hell of a lot about Ireland as well. So going into this, I said, well, this will be as simple, I'll go back and we'll discover about the Celts. And I'm like, the Celts will be excellent. So we'll find out about the Celts and that'll be the story. And then all of a sudden I found myself 5 levels of abstraction later learning about like out of Africa theory and the Neanderthals and things like this. I remember I found a video about you and you're talking and saying there's like this little bumpkin in the back of your head that means you're a Neanderthal. And I was feeling around, I was like, oh no. Oh no! Am I one of these like beasts from the beginning of time? So
throwback.
Maybe you could start there a little bit, because like the assumptions that people would have is that the Neanderthals are all grugs. And it turns out that they were much more complicated than we might think. We've got actually a large amount of admixture. David Reich, who is somebody that I'm assuming you get an awful lot of information off as well, is even going, only in like the last couple of weeks, showing you how current all of this stuff is, suggesting that the Neanderthal admixture in Europeans might be actually massive, reforming even out of Africa theory as we understand it into a more multivariant hypothesis. So I'll kind of throw that bone to you, and maybe we could dig into some of those topics. And people, my friends, will work our way to the Celts in Ireland in a little bit.
Yeah, okay. Well, we're not going to get bogged down in the Paleolithic, ancient ice age and pre-human things. We've got to go over this really quick to get to the Celtic part. But basically, yes, the majority of our ancestry comes from Homo sapiens who evolved in Africa and came out of Africa. But what Reich has determined, and then also we know since at least 2009, we know thanks to Svante Pääbo, who now works with Reich, but previously he was in a different laboratory. He's a Swedish-Finnish guy. But he realized that Neanderthal DNA exists in modern human genome. All non-Africans have a substantial amount of it, although Asians and Europeans have different Neanderthal genes, so different parts of the Neanderthal genome survive in different races. But what people assume is that like, okay, we're like Africans came out and got a little bit of Neanderthal DNA because we're mostly descended from the Africans with a little bit of Neanderthal DNA. But what Reich was trying to explain in a recent interview is that the reason we have 5%, only 5%, or less than 5% in most cases, Neanderthal DNA in modern Europeans is because of an assortment process that has been going on for tens of thousands of years since Neanderthals went extinct, whereby a lot of the genes we got from Neanderthals were not advantageous. So they've been selected out of the gene pool. So instead of, he was saying it could be, not necessarily is, it could be argued that rather than Europeans being Africans with Neanderthal admixture, they're Neanderthals with African admixture. Wow. But it's just that over the process of like genetic assortment from selection pressures, a lot of the Neanderthal genes were disadvantageous due to susceptibility to certain pathogens. Like our general health was threatened by the certain parts of the Neanderthal genome. So, but many things, we do have that as part of us, and also other races like Asians and especially Australasians have this Denisovan DNA from another species as well, which was originally thought to just be a close relative of Neanderthals, but now they're not even sure that's the case. It could be significantly more divergent than that. And also even the Africans aren't the pure human beings either, because subsequent to the out of Africa migrations, the populations within particularly West Africa interbred with species we don't even know what they are yet, because we haven't identified them in the fossil record or in any ancient genomic samples. And that can be up to 19% maybe in some West Africans. So they're significantly more admixed with non-Homo sapien species than non-Africans. And then also it's complicated by the fact that it's not like there was one out of Africa migration, but there were many migrations out of Africa and into Africa, back and forth. So the idea of like human lineage in this ancient time as a tree, like an Adam and Eve, and then all the people flourish out of that, it just doesn't work. You've got to get the Bible out your brain. It's just not like that. It's more like Lord of the Rings with all different weird looking races constantly like fighting and spreading. Sometimes they go extinct here, but then another lot came and then replace them, and then they get extinct, and then but they interbred with him and they interbred again. It's a lot of interbreeding and then genocide or extinction from other causes happening over and over again for hundreds and thousands of years. The real story is too complicated for most people to understand. And it's going to get more and more complicated the more we discover. So if you want a TLDR of early human history, just imagine it as this complicated knotwork like that Celtic knotwork art from medieval times, just this mess of webs of lines going all over the place into this big blob of nets. It's so complicated, I can't hardly understand it.
So fantastic. And I guess like I'd like to cover some, instant things that will pop up, because people hear this stuff, maybe they jump to very, very emotional mental models to say out Africa is wrong and it's all a conspiracy theory and all this type of stuff. And you were addressing this, for example, that like out Africa there's definitely a part of the story where humans are coming out of Africa, but then there's obviously a problem where they're also going back in. And then there's things like the Neanderthals in some sense came out of, like, is it the Middle East, I believe they came out, which probably came from Africa as well. So what do you like? I think maybe the philosophical thing that helps an awful lot of people here is to think about the idea of a mental model. As far as I understand, Reich even speaks about this as well. He says that he's gathering a large amount of data. We live in the era of information and data, and they're literally sitting there with all this data and just throwing models at it and talking to each other and saying what models fit. It's almost like a Nietzschean paradigm shift period. And so our problem right now is that it's almost impossible for us to grab a real model, because new information will just come and obliterate it very, very soon because of how fast things are moving. Like, I don't. Do you think that frame is correct? What model are you sort of looking at? Are you just like suspending all firmness for the time being? How's your kind of head at the moment?
Well, I'm not a scientist. I'm not a geneticist. I'm an historian and a science communicator. So I work for the World Health Organization in science communication. So I try and like build narratives. The way this is how like the media works. Like you condense these things into digestible narratives. And, humanists like Alice Roberts in 2009, even before the Neanderthal DNA was released by Svante Pääbo, was trying to like talk about human origins in a narrative story that was familiar to people, so it resembles the biblical narrative of like an origin point. And the out of Africa pre-2009 theory of like that model, if you will, or narrative, that has been debunked. So if you want to think of like out of Africa as an Eden, the idea of Africa as the Eden whence all mankind sprung, that has been debunked. But some people misunderstand that to think the whole idea of African origins in modern humans is debunked. No, we definitely have ancestry from Africa, but the idea that this is this wellspring from, the origin of all humans, that's not true. And we don't really know where a lot of the other hominids came from. It's assumed that Africa is an origin for many other hominids, but, there are ape species in Borneo, like the orangutans in Borneo and Sumatra. So like, if all great apes originate there, how, this is like, there are great apes all over the world. There are none in the Americas now, but like there are prehistoric great ape species that have gone extinct a long time ago. It's not really certain where great apes emerge. And it may, and there's a perfectly plausible model where the primitive monkey things that humans evolved out of in Africa themselves migrated into Africa from Europe. So then that's a possible thing as well. There were very primitive hominids long before humans even existed in Europe. Mm-hmm. So the idea, because there's a great diversity of apes in the fossil record, hominids in the fossil record in Africa, means Africa's a homeland, that's not evidence enough as itself. The reason really that we focus on it more is to do with like evidence of like haplogroups and like genetic convergence with like early lineages of modern humans are found in Africans today. And you can see particularly groups like the Khoisan, or what we used to call Hottentots. They are very distinct from, I don't know what, you're not supposed to say that anymore, but or Bushmen. I think the Boers call them Bushmen, but I think the politically correct term is Khoisan, which is because the two different main ethnic groups are Khoi and San, and they hyphenate them into one. But Hottentots was the old word, and Hottentots were always recognized as being a different race from what were the other race of sub-Saharan Africans, which were formerly referred to with a word beginning with N. But now they're all lumped as sub-Saharan Africans. But like we do have some kind of, there's highly divergent lineages, but it does seem like the Khoisan come from this extreme divergent lineage no other humans are on, but that probably originally goes into something that all other humans come from. So that's why, I don't know if you ever look at the San people, they kind of look like a little bit like all the other races recognizable in their faces somehow, like a little bit like black people, a little bit like Asians, a little bit like European. I think they're very interesting to look at.
Unfortunately, Zoom we could not get working. We could not get the software. I'm too much of a boomer, I'm afraid. So I maybe could have pulled up examples as Tom was talking about these. You could take a look at this stuff. But unfortunately, dear listeners, dear audience, you're going to have to look this stuff up yourself. But just on a reference to something, Tom, that you're saying there, that again, I think is very valuable. I obviously talk about Nietzsche an awful lot. This is... and it's very fascinating to look at you as well, because the narrative question, the question of how we construct reality in our heads, it's actually a very big philosophical first principle question. You say to yourself, like, where do we come from? And we try to grasp a simple narrative of, like, Eve and Adam and Eden, and then we construct it this way. And what we're getting confronted with now with science is this constant smashing of new information, and then the breaking down of old paradigms. And we'll get into the Indo-Europeans later, because we've gone through this actually only in the last couple of years. People said, like, the Indo-European thing is a racist belief, then it basically gets proven, then it gets kind of reframed again because of the, like, Ardi Yamnaya, they're all like maybe a bit darker than we expect. Now it's turning out that there might have been like plagues before. There's all sorts of crazy things just coming at us, and you notice that there's this desire to clutch for certainty when it's like, wait a second, it's far more sophisticated, almost like to train your mind like a Buddhist, to prepare yourself for different narratives. If you have any comment on that, I'd love to hear it, but I'm going to ask you one more thing about the Neanderthals after this, and then we can move on to maybe the hunter-gatherers. But any thoughts on narratives?
Yeah, only to say that, like, narratives need a beginning and they need an end, but we don't have either of those with this human story. The human story doesn't have a beginning that we can point to yet, and doesn't have an end. And we don't all agree on a desired end yet. We don't have a collective. The idea of humanity is extremely modern, and it is not scientific.
Yeah.
Humanity does not have a scientific definition. Human being is not a human. That's the real problem, that scientists working within a liberal framework, we inherit this Christian idea of humanity. Muslims have a similar idea. It doesn't have a scientific verification. Sometimes they're redefining. Some scientists have argued, even for the last 5 years, they said, wait. We need to redefine other hominid species as human. We need to use the word human to include them, because formerly we'd say Neanderthals and humans. But now Homo sapien was, 5-10 years ago, was a synonym for human. But now they're like, whoa. Human needs to encompass other hominids, because we're realizing now that most of the humans now have lots of DNA from other things. And we can't then say you're 19% non-human, because that would dehumanize, literally. And that's like, forbidden within political context. So like, there is the human subject, is a philosophical idea, not a scientific idea.
Wow, that's so fascinating to think about this. And again, like, people would maybe look at you and be like, what the hell is this guy fucking like talking about genetics? And then he talks about religion. But it's like, these things are much more related than you might think, because you're crashing through information and you're trying to mentally world model it. And that's actually a very, very deep study in philosophy and shaping the world. And then, of course, religion's not far from that. Like, religion is essentially lifting up a mythos and promoting it to the world and saying this is reality. So it's a very fascinating moment that we live in the world. I'm going to ask you about the Neanderthals, because these are some of the trip-ups I believe I came across. They're gingers. Like, I'm thinking about the Neanderthals, and am I like a Homo sapien looking at a Neanderthal here with the ginger hair and all this? Is this how what it would have looked like? And then I remember discovering that the genes were like, the Neanderthals have an older set of genes. We have new sets of genes. The Neanderthals have like a huge diversity. They're like almost 1 million years old and stuff like this. So, is it a mistake to say the Neanderthals were the original Irish? Is what I'm asking.
I think that is a mistake to say. I mean, I remember like, back in 2017, I made a video talking about a paper that said that certain British phenotypes were Neanderthal in origin. I'm not sure about all that now. I think talking about like phenotypes of Neanderthals is pretty speculative, because it's not you can't test it. Like, we can see when we look at like the genes in modern people and how they're expressed, like we can say, oh, this gene is associated with ginger people, and then we can see what in the child of like how it's expressed. Like, many people have, from 23andMe, it'll say you have a 20% chance of being ginger, because they'll see the genes for being ginger, but that doesn't mean they're expressed that way. But you can't do that with Neanderthal, because we don't know, we can't look at them, we can't see them. You can only see the bones, in the fossil record. So the way that genes, many of these physical traits that you see in people are called polygenic, meaning it's not one gene, it's many different genes together interacting to cause an external trait. And we can only know for sure how those polygenic effects manifest in existing organisms. When it comes to anything that doesn't exist anymore, it's quite speculative. And the further you go back in time, the more speculative it is. So I really don't want to talk about Neanderthal phenotypes because I don't know. I mean, obviously, we know a lot about their phenotypes based on their skeleton. We can say with confidence their height, their build, the shape of their face. But when we talk about things taken from the genetics, like about hair color and stuff, I'm not so certain about that.
Just really valuable, almost like philosophical training, because you just brought up something there that's very difficult for people to grasp. People are like, were the Neanderthals all blonde, or were they all like, what did they look like and all this? And this is something that a lot of people just don't get with genes. It took me a while to get it as well. Like the Scottish, for example, I think 40% of them carry the genetics for red hair, but only 16% of them express the genetics. Now people will think about that and they're like, what the fuck does that mean? Well, it's almost like we have the alphabet, we have the genome, and you carry the genome for maybe like 400 different people inside you in a weird way, but only one of them gets expressed with its specific sort of assortment of everything. So there's a difference between a genotype and a phenotype. A genotype is like the information, a phenotype is like what you do with it. So a genotype is like the alphabet, phenotype is like the novel you write with it or the poem you write with it. So maybe you can look and you can find the genotype in the Neanderthals, and you can guess that maybe they might have had this phenotype, but there's no way of knowing for certain. And these are actually very fascinating things to come to comprehend and understand. So that's pretty cool. But I guess we'll move on then, because human origins seems like we're a bit more hybrid than we might think. What kind of happens then is, and this is where we start to get into like modern European history. There's essentially an ice age, which is a nice sort of like beginning of the story, I guess, if you wish. And at that point, Neanderthals had fully intermixed in Europe with the people call them Cro-Magnon. I'm not sure if you agree with that category. And then at this point, about 12,000 years ago or so, just around about the Ice Age, you're having these hunter-gatherers roaming around Europe. I've read all sorts of stuff about people like these Gravettians that were like 6'4" or 5 or something like this, that ate loads of meat. And then there was obviously Cheddar Man, who was apparently a black man, but it turns out he wasn't a black man. And then there's all sorts of things like this. So I guess there's a couple of kind of questions I would have. First of all, is I think I saw a recent study somewhere showing the diversity of phenotype or genetic expressions in the Cro-Magnon, the hunter-gatherers, and it was simply enormous. Like they had all the way from like pale, red-haired, light eyes, all the way to like extremely dark, that would kind of be like shocking. And it was this huge spread of different type of people, which is one, very fascinating. And number two, there seems to be like several stages that make up these characters, and these seem to be some of the first founders of Europe. And most importantly, there's a lot of them still in Europe today. This is the I haplogroup in some sense, although that's not the perfect way to say it. And you yourself apparently are a descendant of one of these. So maybe you could tell me a little bit about that.
Okay. So actually, Cro-Magnon is a French term that was used like in Victorian anthropology and stuff to refer to all Paleolithic and Stone Age man up until the Neolithic, basically. But now we know that actually there's so many different races involved within that's too broad a term. No one uses that term anymore because it encompasses so many different races. So forget Cro-Magnon. But when we come out of the Ice Age in Europe, or in the Ice Age in Europe, like to simplify, West Europe is mostly a Magdalenian culture. Which is also a race. By the way, for a while in 20th century, people just talked about the cultures and assumed that there were no genetic things. But now the genetics is showing that when you see a material culture, it's usually attached to a racial group. And when that culture changes, it's probably because of a racial replacement of some kind. But anyway, not always, but usually. But anyway, the Southeastern Europe had Gravettians or Epigravettians. And after the Ice Age, things get warmer and nicer, and a lot of the megafauna that define the Ice Age, like massive animals, they're sort of dwindling now. Humans have been killing a lot of them, and also the changing climate is killing some of them as well. So in the Mesolithic, that's when you get like the start to see the Europe you recognize now. In the Ice Age, northern Scotland and not Scandinavia was all under glaciers, and like Spain and southern France are very important regions for looking at that Ice Age Europe, because that's where people could live. Like going further north, there wasn't really many people, or maybe they were, but they were going to be hunting on the ice like Eskimo kind of people, What changes in the Mesolithic is you get broadleaf trees spreading further north, up into what we now see is like oaks and a forest that you recognize of Britain and Ireland. That kind of thing is formed in the Mesolithic. So the world that we recognize. And the Epigravettians kind of replace Magdalenians, and the people who come out of in Western Europe, and the Western Europe, the people who come out of that Epigravettian cluster and become the definitive hunter-gatherers of Western Europe in the Mesolithic are known as Western hunter-gatherers, or WHGs by geneticists. And Cheddar Man belonged to that group, and they lived all over Spain, all over Italy, all over Britain and Ireland, and Sweden as well. But Eastern Europe, they got their ancestors were replaced to some extent by a Siberian population in Eastern Europe called ancient North Eurasians, who had been mammoth hunters on the Siberian mammoth steppe, and they formed a new group by mixing with these Western hunter-gatherer-like DNA or Epigravettian-like DNA called Eastern hunter-gatherers. So in the Mesolithic, broadly speaking, very broadly, there are two different groups of Europeans. In Eastern Europe, Eastern hunter-gatherers, and in Western Europe, Western hunter-gatherers. The Eastern ones are more likely to have fairer skin, brown eyes, brown hair, and the ones in Western Europe have blue eyes, brown to black hair, and darker skin. Not as black as Cheddar Man, that was an extreme example, but if you look all over Europe, people have done reconstructions of the Western hunter-gatherers, and they've given different complexions, but actually they didn't have all the same complexion any more than modern Irish people all have the same complexion. You know, you get some lighter and some darker. So some of them were probably as dark as an Arab, at least. I very much doubt they would have pitch black skin like a Senegalese person or something like that. That would be because even within Africa, that's not what people had. Like this Khoisan I mentioned earlier, Khoisan hunter-gatherers in South Africa, they don't have black skin. They have a kind of coffee-colored skin, light coffee-colored skin, similar to an Arab, basically. But that seems to be like the default complexion of human beings. Somewhat like you see them in Thailand, Native Americans, certain Arabs, it's a sort of light brown color. And that's probably like an average human complexion over time, over the entire globe, over the span of human history. Very, very black skin is actually an unusual thing that you see sometimes come up in parts of Africa and Australia. These people were the first main group to settle Ireland. Britain in that time was still attached to sort of Holland, Belgium, and Doggerland had been a thing earlier on that connected all Denmark all the way to England. But by the late Neolithic, it starts to Britain starts to separate. But Ireland had always been separate from Britain. So for the people, these Western hunter-gatherers, they settled Britain, and then some of them would have gone over on some primitive boats, canoes or whatever, into Ireland and settled there. I think that was still a megaloceros, or the Irish elk, as it's sometimes called, was an enormous Ice Age species still living there, but they didn't last long once humans got in there anyway. You can see them in the museums in Ireland.
So you've said, I believe I've heard you say before that you're a descendant from the ancient North Eurasians. You were saying you've at least got some genetics from them.
Everyone does. Pretty much everyone in Eurasia descends from the ancient North Eurasians because they contributed to so many different races. They were, besides Eastern hunter-gatherers, also Caucasian hunter-gatherers descended from them. And so even everyone in India has a bit of their DNA. Everyone in Asia has DNA. There's nothing special about that. My paternal and maternal lineages are both from Western hunter-gatherers, which is not usual. A lot of people have Western hunter-gatherer maternal lineages because they survived the many different replacements that happened over time. But the paternal lineages are less common. My paternal lineage is I1, which is associated with Germanic people like Vikings, but it is thought to originate in the Western hunter-gatherers, although as yet we've never found a Western hunter-gatherer with that lineage. But because it's so divergent and ancient, and it's just all the Western hunter-gatherers have I2 lineages, which are
that's in the Balkans, isn't it?
It's in the Balkans today, but it was all of Ireland, all of Britain, all of Western Europe had these lineages. But I1 only appears for the first time, sort of just as the Bronze Age is happening in Scandinavia, in an elite Indo-European context. And we know the earliest Indo-European kings actually had I2 from Western hunter-gatherers. So it's possible that the Indo-European languages actually came from Western hunter-gatherers, or it could be from Eastern hunter-gatherers, because later on, the main lineages of the Indo-Europeans are mostly associated with R1A and R1B, which both come from the Eastern European hunter-gatherers. So it's almost certainly a European indigenous language group that later came to dominate all of Eurasia. But we're not there yet. We've skipped forward to the Bronze Age from Mesolithic.
There's so many fascinating things about these guys. Again, like, people will probably be caught up with this, but like, some of the details about this stuff is nuts. Like, we'll get into the Neolithics worshipping apparently like idols that were shaped on the I haplogroup people, is what I say. But I have a question then. So you've obviously been here for a while. You know, if you're I on both sides, you've been rocking around for a while. You're familiar. You're a denizen, you know. There's a significant amount of people in Ireland, like, still I think it's 10%, maybe even 15% across like Western Europe that basically will have this amount. I guess one thing I'd kind of ask is the idea of just getting a sense of like what these people represent, because these are obviously very, very old. But I remember looking before at one of these haplogroup maps. I understand you can't take all this stuff too seriously, but height is very, very tied to haplogroup, for example. And I think the tallest places in Europe are the Balkans, which is very heavy I2 haplogroup, and the Germanic places, Holland, Denmark, I was going to say Danelaw, Denmark and Scandinavia. And they're all very high haplogroup dominant. Like, the very tall parts seem to have an awful lot of this. Now, am I like making a big correlation here? Is there something like this you can kind of look at? Or
the correlation is not causation in that case.
Okay.
You know, it's just the haplogroups become attached to only a small part of the DNA, and they become associated with certain races because they dominate within that race. So all the people in that race will have that haplogroup. And if that race is a taller race, then that haplogroup will be associated with tallness, but it's not the haplogroup causing that tallness. Okay. It's different genes causing the tallness.
So another question, and again, you're going to be like, all right, Steph, amateur hour here. But obviously we look at the Scandinavians and be like, these are very beautiful people, like basically the image of beauty in the world. Now, they're obviously very high I haplogroup, very, very good looking, and then I haplogroup is sort of that type of distinct look. If you even look at the Scandinavians, they're a bit rugged as well. Like, why are they good looking? It's almost like because they're handsome in a way. They've got very, very robust features. They look very proud and strong. You look at Dolph Lundgren, you know, and he's just like this image of like an Ubermensch. You're like, that's a very highly evolved caveman or something like this. Is there something there that we could say? Because I remember looking at this, and I was, you know, the typical phenotype of the golden skin, the golden blonde hair and the blue eyes is like, you know, the archetype of beauty. And I think I was seeing some of those reconstructions, and they were saying that was present in the hunter-gatherers in Scandinavia. The sort of marriage of the East and the West developed that sort of phenotype, and it was starting to show up there in the North. And even today, you know, it's still very present in that place. So is there something to that? Is that obviously massively speculative? What do you think?
This gets a bit complicated now because first off, modern Scandinavians don't really descend from Scandinavian hunter-gatherers. Because the two groups I mentioned before in Mesolithic Europe, Western and Eastern hunter-gatherers, they mixed together in Scandinavia to form a separate group called Scandinavian hunter-gatherers, which is best, you know, because that was like the crossover zone where they existed, the two different types. But then the Scandinavian hunter-gatherers were mostly wiped out by the Neolithic farmers, who invaded Europe from Anatolia around 8,000 years ago. Europe gets taken over by these farmers who breed with Western hunter-gatherers as they come into Europe, and they reach Britain and Ireland like 6,000 years ago, maybe Ireland like 5,700 years ago, and they're all mixing with the Western hunter-gatherers, and they're introducing farming, and they're the people who built the stone circles and new grange and things like that. And they have a much more gracile phenotype, which is associated with modern Europeans. Modern-day Sardinians are almost 100% from these Neolithic Anatolian European farmers. Like the European farmers, they're basically Anatolian with a little bit of Western hunter-gatherer mixed in. So yeah, a Sardinian looks like a modern European. Like in Southern Europe, the average Southern European is like something like 75% descended from them, and in Northern Europe, it's about 50%. So the number one component of all European ancestry is this Neolithic European thing. But they came into Europe, into northern Scandinavia, replaced most of the Scandinavian hunter-gatherers, and then another wave of invaders took over Western Europe at the end of the Neolithic, beginning of Bronze Age, called the Indo-Europeans, and they were pastoralists from Ukraine. And then they came into Scandinavia and they wiped out whatever was left of the hunter-gatherers there. But so Scandinavians have hunter-gatherer DNA, but that is a mixture they've taken that from the Neolithic farmers and from the Indo-Europeans, same as everyone else. But they have higher levels than most other parts of Europe. And that hunter-gatherer DNA is from Western hunter-gatherers and Eastern hunter-gatherers, which both contributed to Scandinavian hunter-gatherer DNA as well. And Scandinavian hunter-gatherers may have shared some phenotypes with modern Scandinavians because they share ancestry from the same two hunter-gatherer groups. And there might be some convergence there where what happens. But the actual modern Scandinavian phenotype is the product of complicated selection pressures that have been ongoing since the Bronze Age. So blondism has been becoming more prominent over the Bronze Age and Iron Age in all of Northern Europe, not just Scandinavia. So the same, like for example, in Britain and Ireland, selection pressures from the Bronze Age into the Iron Age have made us fairer skinned, but the same pressures happen in Scandinavia separately. So it's happening across all Northern Europe in separate locales without not consequence of intermixing between these locations that everyone's getting lighter. The same selection pressures are causing all of them to get lighter. So it's to do with the switch to a farmer diet, because you can be a hunter-gatherer with low light and get enough nutrients from the food. But if you're going to eat grains and live in a dark part of the world, in a cold, dark part of the world, then you need to get lighter skin so that you can supplement the nutrients that you would have got from a hunter-gatherer diet. Instead, you get more from the sun instead. But looking at Scandinavians, I lived in Sweden for 3 years. You can see some of them exhibit very robust, strong, broad faces with like broad, high cheeks and square jaws, like with short chins, and that's a hunter-gatherer phenotype, which they can either inherit from the Indo-Europeans who had hunter-gatherer DNA or from the farmers who had hunter-gatherer DNA. But some of them have more gracile, thin faces and, more, someone would say more beautiful features in that sense. And that's a trait that comes from the Anatolian farmers as well. Wow. So you can see all three hunter-gatherer, Indo-European, and Neolithic farmer traits in different Scandinavians. But the same is true for all Europeans. But I'd say the difference is that in Scandinavia, you're more likely to see people with archaic hunter-gatherer traits, such as a WHG jawline, or of course, blue eyes. Blue eyes is a WHG trait. All blue eyes in the world come from Mesolithic European ancestry. So if you have blue eyes, or you know anyone blue eyes, that's where it comes from.
Wow, very fascinating. Again, going back to the mental models, because just on that point you're saying about the long face, shall we say, being a early European farmer trait, that's actually quite fascinating, because that would have been like the sort of the Nordicist ideal. I remember you read about that and they would always say that the long face is the sign of like the ancient Hyperborean Aryan, and now it's like that actually came from the Neolith. That's very fascinating. And then the hunter-gatherer was like the square head, big powerful features and all this. So that's a very interesting thing to contemplate.
Well, I can comment on why they might have come to this conclusion, because not all the farmers across Europe had the exact same look. In fact, like the ones in Britain and Ireland were quite dark and short, but a certain group of them in Poland and Germany, called the globular amphora culture, they interbred quite a lot with hunter-gatherers, and they developed this unique phenotype where they were sometimes blonde, not as blonde as any modern populations are, but sometimes they were blonde, and they had these very skinny, long faces, like unusual, that others didn't have. Anyway, they evolved that, and that they are, when the early Proto-Indo-Europeans mixed with them, not with the other farmers. So when the Indo-Europeans spread across Europe, like the main Indo-European culture, the corded ware culture, that spread all across Europe and Asia, and is responsible for the Aryans in Asia and India, and the people who came to Ireland. Pretty much all Indo-Europeans, with the exception of only 3 groups in the world today, are descended from them. And they were already mixed with, from the earliest stage, the specific group of farmers called globular amphora culture, who have this narrow face. So some early anthropologists might have just noticed that they were spreading this phenotype. So it would have existed among people who spoke Proto-Indo-European as well, because they mixed with them at that early stage. So, and also some blondes would have existed among the Proto-Indo-European speakers because they'd mixed with this sometimes blonde-haired group called globular amphora culture. And we have, as a result, in modern Northwest Europeans like British and Irish, although we're about half of our ancestry comes from Neolithic farmers, that doesn't all come from the Neolithic farmers who lived in Britain and Ireland. In fact, most of it doesn't come from local farmers. It comes from those farmers in Poland who the Indo-Europeans mixed with before they invaded here.
Wow. Just on this idea of like these population types and all this showing up, Latin America is a very interesting place where you can see this process, because it's only 500 years since they essentially had like massive population replacement.
Right.
And you go to somewhere like Argentina or something like this, and you'll see every now and again a German pop up, and a blonde, blue-eyed, or an Irish person, and then you'll see these like Andes type, or like these ancient Latin Americans, and I mean South Latin America from the mountains, and they have these like really long faces. It's very fascinating. Look, they don't look like the normal Latin Americans, but they have these kind of like long faces, and so you're seeing all these phenotypes like pop up. But in the long run, like Brazil, for example, they all kind of blend together, and they start to develop actually their new type, if you will. So there's these root things that are feeding in, but then it all gets sloshed together, and then the genotype just gets full, and then the phenotypic express. So like the genotype is the information, the expression of the different novels you can make out of that alphabet. Obviously, it's still there, but it starts to get buried a little bit, and so it starts to maybe even become a bit more unified in a weird way. So you can see that process.
In Britain and Ireland, the British groups and the Irish are all descended from the same populations, but they don't look the same today. Like you can tell, Scottish and English have different looks, Irish have different looks from British, but even though they have the same ingredients, because they've been separated long enough, and there's like a filtration process where certain phenotypes are coming together. Like you said, like they've mixed to get the same ingredients, but they've mixed in different ways. So like, and if they spend a long enough time apart, then they start to develop their own phenotypes. And crucially as well, the Irish had not had the selection pressures from the Industrial Revolution for as long as the British, because the Industrial Revolution happened there much later, which probably overall good for the Irish genome, because the Industrial Revolution although it has positive social and economic effects, it has negative effects on the phenotype.
So let's go back, because we'll get into the Neolithics now, because this is again mental model stuff. Philosophical paradigms are very, very useful here, because we have this tendency to want to throw stories up. I when I was coming into this, I was like this. I had this tendency to disrespect these poor Neolithics. I was like, they're Italians, they're pizza cells, they invented grains. And what's the story you hear on like Twitter and stuff like this? It's like, why is modern man weak? You look at yourself in the mirror and you're like, why am I not an Ubermensch? And everybody has this like anxiety. I need to look smacks. I need to become better. I need to look like Marcus, the golden one, and all this. And you assume that there's something wrong with, as you said, industrial society is making you frail. And back in the days, the hunter-gatherers are strong and powerful and profound. And so you read through this history and you discover that there was these hunter-gatherers, and then these little Neolithics came, and they came from the Middle East of all places, And so you say they came and they took us out, and they made us weak, and they were shorter and they were smaller and all this. And so that's the kind of tendency, is you believe that these guys came up and they did all these terrible things, and they're like almost like a bad part of your genetics that you want to wash out. The more you dig into it, though, you start to discover things like they might be related to beauty. They might have actually carried many of these ideal phenotypes people talk about. I saw a paper recently suggesting that they might have actually been the source of a lot of our high IQs, which is, that's a big one. There's obviously the thing where these people weren't pushovers. Like there was the one that, this was obviously like early clashing with this paradigm. You see people like Bronze Age Perver would talk about like the matriarchy and all this type of stuff. And then he was obviously commenting on this stuff earlier. And these people don't seem like they were like pushovers, or they were like an emasculated sort of cult like this. Again, these are just mental models getting thrown up early. But it turns out, as information came out, that these people were actually fighters. They invented war, as we might understand it, or organized violence and things like this. And they might have been great conquerors. Even as Dan Davis was saying, that they're great adventurers. These people built boats and sailed to Ireland and Britain and stuff like this. So there's a very fast, and then obviously like Newgrange and the megaliths and all this. And they're most importantly, they're 50% of what we are. What do you see about that mental model? This idea of like the appeal to hunter-gatherer as this sort of like standard of what's based, you know, and then maybe problems with that, or maybe there's virtue to that. It obviously brings its attributes. The Neolithics, were they a downgrade? Were they just simply a downgrade in some ways, but an upgrade in others? How do you look at this stuff?
Well, lot to go through there, but like the Neolithic people, our hunter-gatherer DNA comes to us via the farmers, because the farmers mix with them. We don't have any, you know, ancestry that doesn't come either via the farmers or via the Indo-European pastoralists, both of whom had hunter-gatherer ancestry. And the farmers were not monolithic at all. There's totally different cultures from like the Vincher in the east. You know, the first metal workers in the world were European farmers in the Balkans, and they probably invented the wheel, because the earliest wheels in the world are found in Central and Eastern Europe. And there's like 3 different sites all in Central and Eastern Europe just over 5,000 years ago. You know, there's some stuff similar coming at a similar time in the Near East, it doesn't seem like there's any cross-cultural relationship, and there's not even the same style. So it doesn't, if it might have independently invented in different places, but it does seem most likely at this stage that the wheel was an invention, that is the axled wheel, of these European farmers. Although some people think the Indo-Europeans had them, there's no evidence the Indo-Europeans had them earlier than the farmers. So if it would make more sense for the Indo-Europeans to have them because they needed them on the steppe, but the Indo-Europeans definitely did have them very soon after. But the Cucuteni-Trapilia culture is right on their borders. As you also mentioned on Twitter, Cucuteni-Trapilia in Romania is an early European farmer culture, which some people say had the first ever cities. But this is a contentious claim because what is a city, blah, 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 blah. But the point is they had very large settlements, probably the largest in the world at that time. So they were very advanced, and they were doing all kinds of amazing things in their different cultures. But these are not one people, these different things. Like I think the dichotomy that used to be made between like Aryan or Indo-European culture and the Neolithic, it goes back to like Victorian times, and they sort, you know, like they would call in the skeletal record, they would look at the Neolithic farmers in Britain and Ireland and call them the Iberian type. Oh yeah, because they noticed the skulls of these guys in like New Grange resembled that of modern day Iberians, and then the skulls of the Beaker folk, the first Indo-Europeans in the British Isles, were referred to as the Celtic type, which and they were in those days believed to have brought Celtic languages to the British Isles, but now we know they didn't. It's just a second migration brought them after that. But the general skull type of the early Indo-European settlers in the British Isles resembles modern Irish people's skulls. So that's why they called it the Celtic type. And that's because modern Irish people descend mostly from those first wave of Indo-Europeans who came in, and that includes your farmer DNA because it was brought in by them as well.
Okay, it's just for me to get that around my head then for a second. So, because obviously the idea, we'll get to this now a little bit more in a moment. The idea is that there was a load of farmers. These are the ones, the Neolithic farmers who ran Newgrange and all this. You're saying that all of that DNA was completely wiped out, and then the DNA that was in the Indo-Europeans came in, and that's
not all. I'd say it's something like 90% was wiped out.
Wow.
So like most of it. So like, and the people who came in were quite varied in their amounts of steppe versus farmer DNA. Some of them, like the one guy from Rathlin Island, Northern Ireland, he's like 80%, you know, Neolithic Ukrainian. He's like very, very, he's almost like a pure steppe with almost no farmer DNA. Whereas other people, also Indo-European context burials in the British Isles from the same time, can be only 20% from the steppe and almost all farmer. Because at this stage, this new race was still being formed. It's like you talked about in South America. So there's some of them would be like two guys buried right next to them. One of them would be really, really high steppe, and the other would be really low steppe, but they were the same people. But then what happens, it quickly averages out about 50-50 in Northwestern Europe, 50-50 from Holland to Ireland, all across. But the modern day Irish is still about 50-50, but there's been some other changes since then. You've subsequently got some DNA from the Celts and the Vikings and things like that. But overall, you're still pretty much the same. But my point was about the like dichotomy between like the farmer and the other. It does have some relevant, actually. It's not entirely old-fashioned bunkum, because although it's not fair to typify these farmers as weak, matriarchal cucks, like longhouses, whatever, that's not fair. They were warriors and they were great people, but they had a very, very, very different cultural idea and a different idea of hierarchy from the Indo-Europeans. And if I try to sum that up quickly, it's more like the previous people were able to organize large amounts of labor for massive monuments much more effectively than Indo-Europeans, because they had a more conformist, or what would be like, I don't know, almost Oriental style culture that you would see in early Egyptian and Chinese civilizations, where lots of people working together on projects and living close together. But the Indo-Europeans didn't live like that. They liked to be more separate, more dependent on, because they lived as cowboys, they were more spread out, and they liked big open spaces, and they didn't come together on massive monument building. And they're, instead of like you see in like these Newgrange tomb, for example, the guys in the tomb is the same bloodline for generation after generation after generation ruling that area. And you go all the way across Ireland to County Sligo, the guys in the tomb there are his like close relatives as well. Wow. So like you've got very, very small amounts of people ruling across the whole vast areas. It's like very elite dynasties, yes, like God King pharaohs. The Indo-Europeans, when you see like their elite burials, these round barrows in Britain and Ireland, and all these kurgans, they're known as in Russia. This is the original Indo-European monument, these round barrows. You can see a barrow is like an elite grave of a chieftain. But in a barrow field, you can go in two different barrows right next to each other, and those guys have no relation to each other whatsoever. Wow. So they're more like, their elites are just like brave warriors or something like that, who have proven themselves to be good at acquiring land and defeating enemies, and so they have power. Whereas the old system was much more like a kind of, a pharaoh kind of system. So what I'm trying to say is that in the way the Indo-Europeans were more individualistic, mm-hmm, and they were less conservative in that way. So were they the first cucks? Were the Europeans the libtards? I don't think so. But they definitely had. They were definitely more protean, more Promethean. I don't know what word to use. Those probably inappropriate terms, but they were more adaptable, changing, and they had a disruptive idea of social hierarchy that engendered constant violence and challenge. Whereas the old one had stability. And if you prefer that, then you should probably be more proud of your Neolithic ancestry. But if you like that sort of dynamic, challenging, violent sort of aspect of European history that causes us to like have so many revolutions and changes all the time, well, then you should probably prefer the Indo-European side.
I can imagine if Nietzsche lived to see this type of stuff, he would describe it as like the two forces within European soul tearing at each side. That makes it great, the great tension. That's actually a really beautiful way you've described that, because from my understanding, like that's a really good mental model for it, in that like it makes perfect sense that these Neolithic farmers contemplated the idea of, we could harvest these grasses, and this grass is going to give us stability and it gives us time. And you see all these phenomena begin to show up. They begin to become astrologers because they begin to conceptualize the idea of time. Time becomes fundamental for them existing. This leads to them doing things like planning projects, coordinating together. Individuality gets massively crushed out. I can even imagine like, I'm obviously putting this together in my head, but like a religion of destiny and fatalism, that like you're not an individual that can just go wherever you want. You're restricted by time, like our whole society is. If time and the gods interrupt our society, you're screwed. You get this sort of sequencing. You see the rising up then of destiny, and like, I'm the pharaoh, I'm literally better than you, I'm a god king, I'm separate. You see also the stratification. You see the warrior elites, the violent people. You see the origins of the farmers, the slaves essentially, and these people being turned into like labor forces. Their labor is given up as taxes. Like I imagine the Indo-Europeans might have been a bit like the Americans. The idea of handing up a tax to some type of like inbred pharaoh might have gone against them, this type of thing. So I can see all that. And again, like maybe it's very easy to dismiss this. but it's not probably correct, because you look at like Newgrange. Even I saw that study from only a couple of days ago. Again, I'm not sure if I'm interpreting it correctly, but it was indicating that IQ was quite low, or shall we say the genetics that represent modern capacity to generate IQ. Because maybe we shouldn't say intelligence, but the gene markers that give us the ability to think in the way that we think now. And they were actually quite low during the hunter-gatherer time, and the Neolithics basically max it out. And then when the Indo-Europeans come in, it drops.
That's probably accurate, because the polygenic predictions of IQ are quite accurate. And we're only talking about things from 5,000 years ago. So we should be able to get a pretty good idea of, if we're seeing an increase in the genes that correlate with intelligence today, going from a Mesolithic to Neolithic, I'd say that's probably because that they are more intelligent. And of course, intelligence gets selected for once after farming, because you've got like a higher density of people, then you've got a bigger gene pool to select from. Whereas if you're a hunter-gatherer, you live in a small roving gang of like 10 people, and every few years you meet with another tribe of 10, 20 people, whatever. Your wider breeding network's like 100 people or something like that. It's not, you don't have a lot of choice in your mates, and sometimes it's not in your hands anyway. Like the tribal elder will say, you're marrying this one or whatever. So things like intelligence don't get like selected for as much, not sexually, they get selected for environmentally. Like really dumb hunter-gatherers die because they're too stupid. But I mean, within a large settlement context, you can have sexual selection for pressures for intelligence, where men or women are choosing people from families that are more successful, and then that success is obviously due to the intelligence, which is heritable. So yeah, I'm thinking this is, of course, a process after Neolithic. We're getting more and more intelligent since then.
This very again, another mental model. I'm like just repeating this motif, but it's very valuable when you're dealing with Tom's work, because he constantly throws these out, and these have been very helpful for me to understand this stuff. So like one would be like, who's the blonde people would always be in my head. Who's the blonde people? Who's the Europeans? And like another one is lactose tolerance. You know, we'd say like, oh, the Irish are 97% lactose tolerance. I'd be saying, and Tom would be saying like, look, the Indo-Europeans are maybe about 30%, and they probably generated the genes, but they weren't 90%. And in fact, that was sexually selected or environmentally selected since they conquered Britain and Ireland, which is very fascinating, meaning that like evolution happened really quickly, really recently. And even stuff like blondism, as you said, is something that like was there in the Indo-Europeans and the European farmers. But when it arrived in, I guess you could say, North Germany, Poland, Denmark, it got heavily selected for, which actually made them more blonde over the course of only like 1,000 years, which is fascinating to think about. So it's really quick. It's like, that's barely, it's like Brazil was invented halfway through that process. So that shows you how fast that type of stuff is, so that's a very interesting thing. I guess that would lead me to two questions. Number one, I was going to go into the weird phenomenon of the Neolithics worshipping I haplogroup style looking people. So in Ireland, for example, I remember seeing something you're talking about where the population was pale, black-haired and brown-eyed, but the elites were sexually selecting to try create an Ubermensch who was tall, dark-skinned like the European hunter-gatherers before them, with bright blue eyes and probably dark hair as well. So they were kind of like breeding these Ubermensch, racially separate god kings. And as you said, they were highly stratified as well. So it all gets really weird, because this kind of turns into like this elite, we are like the reptilians above you type thing, the kind of super Freemasons or something like this. And maybe you give me some thoughts on that.
Well, first off, I got to say that this theory of mine is not in any published paper. It's just me looking at published papers and drawing lines and saying, maybe this is what's going to happen. Because, okay, in that Newgrange paper where they found the inbred god king, he was no Ubermensch. Like he probably looked gross. He was so inbred, like heavily inbred. But what I noticed in the phenotype predictions in the supplements of the paper
Tom,
is that...
sorry to pull you up on that, because like people might not understand that context. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about the inbred god kings and what you think like the whole inbreeding thing is all about, because it obviously shows up in the Pharaohs. It shows up even in the European Habsburgs and stuff like this. Again, sorry to interrupt.
Sure. The Cassidy and colleagues paper from 2020 showed that while Neolithic Irish people were not inbred, the elites in these mega tombs like Newgrange were. and specifically the God King of Newgrange was the product of a first degree inbreeding thing, which is like, I think that's like father with daughter or something of equivalent disgusting relation. So that's gross. And normally that doesn't happen in any culture, especially a culture which doesn't have inbred people in it. Like they're not doing that out of necessity. There's plenty of people there. They don't have to inbreed. But the only people who are inbreeding are the elites. It's the same old story we can see in history. Why do elites inbreed? Usually to keep their blood pure for some reason, because they have to, maybe that, and what is it about that is pure? Well, I went back and look at, as I say, the farmers that invaded Europe 8,000 years ago had all these Near Eastern haplogroups, but the farmers in Ireland and Britain didn't have those anymore. Their paternal lineages were all replaced by the indigenous natives, wow. I2. So the indigenous natives have some important role to play in the megalith culture of the west of Europe, because 8,000 years ago, the farmers leave Europe. By 7,000 years ago, they've reached northern France. And they don't cross the water into Britain for another 1,000 years. Something stops them going into Britain. But while they're in northern France, they encounter a custom among the native hunter-gatherers in Brittany of building these big stone slabs around their graves. And that seems to be the origin of the megalith tradition. It begins in Brittany in northwestern France. But the farmers take this crude use of stone slabs to make these large, like, kissed graves, and they just go and make it a massive monument thing, and it gets bigger and bigger. And after 1,000 years, they make the bold step of stepping into Britain. It's only a short crossing. It was shorter then than it is now, and they were perfectly capable of much longer sea journeys, because we can see that from other parts of Europe. Something stopped them going into Britain. I think it was a taboo, because of the hunter-gatherers up there were scary, and they had a big culture in the British Isles or something. Anyway, then we see, like 1,000 years after that, they're building the same big monuments all over Britain and Ireland. And there's some weird thing where, although the hunter-gatherers in Britain and Ireland are gone, they're no longer there. Everyone's mixed with them. Their paternal lineages dominate everywhere. And the phenotypes of the hunter-gatherers are selected for to be more common in the elites than in everyone else. That's what I observed in the supplements on that paper in Ireland. So then, like you say, like the average people were quite light-skinned by then in Ireland, but the inbred God King is predicted to have had dark skin and blue eyes. Dark skin and blue eyes is a Western hunter-gatherer phenotype. So I wonder if the whole megalith cult of Western Europe was somehow like a survival of this ancient hunter-gatherer cult of like hunter-gatherers being elites. It's pure speculation, but it's fun.
I like it. So basically the Neolithics just donated a whole swath of female Latinas up to the old I haplogroup chuds, and then they just took them and then recreated this sort of superculture. Like, so what like, if, to be serious, what I understand you saying then is that the Neolithic guys actually spread up, and maybe the hunter-gatherers might have been like shunted into the hills, and there might have been actually a sort of counterattack that took place, and they might have actually started to reconquist certain parts maybe, and then took over. Or am I adding in a violence that might not be there? Maybe it was just like a sort of blending of the things, and the I haplogroup tended to perform the best or something. What do you understand?
It's hard. Well, we can't. I think many things would have happened across Western Europe at that time. I mean, there's evidence as well of some Western hunter-gatherers maintaining a hunter-gatherer lifestyle thousands of years after the farmers had arrived in the area, and they were living side by side, especially in swampy marshlands, like in like in parts of northern Europe where the farmers couldn't farm anyway, and they didn't want to go. If you could stay there and live off ducks and whatever, hunt waterfowl and have a hunter-gatherer lifestyle for a long time. We also see like quite late examples of people from hunter-gatherer backgrounds moving into and becoming farmers within that context, like long time after the farmers had been there. So sometimes they would want to move into a different lifestyle and marry into the farmers. Maybe something like that was happening the other way as well. Like in the early American settlers, sometimes the Native Americans would kidnap some British guys or some women or whatever, make them live as Indians, and then when the people went to go and rescue them, they're like, I don't want to be rescued. I want to be an Indian. It's better. I don't have any taxes to pay. I don't have to worry about insurance or whatever. So maybe some people wanted to go back to living that way, and maybe these complicated interactions it resulted in an elite lineage in one Neolithic culture somewhere in northwestern France, or being of hunter-gatherer origin. And we don't know what languages the hunter-gatherers spoke, and we don't know what languages the farmers spoke. But it's possible that even the actual dominant language of the megalith culture was, despite the fact most of their DNA came from the Neolithic farmers of Anatolia, it's possible that their language and culture was heavily influenced by the native hunter-gatherers of that region. Because the gap between the advanced farmers and the primitive hunter-gatherers was nowhere near as big as the gap between the European settlers and the indigenous Americans in North America. That gap prevented a lot of the Native Americans from really exerting any cultural influence on the new American culture. They just could not compete at the same level, and their numbers were nowhere near. They couldn't breed at the same rate because they didn't have medicine and everything like that. But in those days, there was a much more even playing field between primitive farmers and hunter-gatherers. So I think that it's quite possible that farmers were influenced by these natives in a way you wouldn't expect.
Well, like you
based in just genetics.
Again, to Latin America, like you actually see everything you're talking about take place there. Like in, I think Peru, when the Spanish first went in, obviously 200 men took over the whole Peruvian, the Incan Empire, and I think they began to intermarry them with the elite. They took harems essentially out of the elite, and then the elite was sort of like a blend of the native elite and the Europeans, and then the kind of servile population, if you will. They would have not only been peasants, obviously not the right word, but they would have been lower class, if you will, and the elite would have been separate. So there was already a genetic stratification there, probably. And then on top of this, you're getting the introduction of European genes. And so this is only one event in history, and we're talking about like thousands of years where like things like this might have happened at length. You look at all the different variety in Latin America. Like Latin America is like a continent. Brazil is dramatically different to Argentina, dramatically different to Chile, dramatically different to Peru. And this is just all like little historical events. So like, yeah, absolutely what you're saying. It's very hard to come up with broad scope things, but I guess it's important for you to point out what's going on here. So one question, I want to ask you how much time you have, because obviously you've probably got limits on this, and then we'll get into the Indo-Europeans.
I can go on for let's go into the Indo-Europeans. I can go on at least for half an hour or so.
Okay, cool. That's good. So we're talking about the Neolithics. We're talking about all this stuff. A lot of drama happening in Western Europe. This forms the, again, some fascinating parts of Irish culture, British culture that people aren't aware of. Like, for example, the thing you just described about Brittany, the creation of those slabs, those tombstones, those megaliths. That leads into Newgrange. There's some really weird things about the Newgrange elite. There's also stuff that I've often wondered about, like Caesar later comes and discovers that there's this sort of central point for the Celtic Gauls in Britain, and I was wondering, was Newgrange and Stonehenge somehow related to some type of operation like that? But basically what happens is, far off in the east, there's this big rising of the great force, the great kind of meme that a lot of people pulled out of all this genetic stuff when David Reich began to bring it up. So this is the Indo-Europeans. So I guess maybe the best place to start is with two mental models. One of them is this idea of the Germans were obviously all possessed by demons in the 20th century, and they came up with this pseudoscientific theory that there was like an Aryan race or something like this. And the genetics, Reich and all them, have actually shown that those guys are pretty close. Like those Victorians who were pontificating this stuff based off language actually were pretty close, although it turns out it wasn't as close as they thought. Like they did get some things wrong, as we were pointing out just there earlier about the problems with dismissing the Iberian type and all this. Maybe that's like a bit more of us than we'd like to admit, but yeah, that turned out to be true, and these people came out of Ukraine, the Indo-Europeans, as they say. Now, you were saying earlier that they sort of formed out of the hunter-gatherers, and they went down into sort of the middle of Russia. I mentally model this as the Neolithics came up, the hunter-gatherers, some of them peeled off, or some of them just avoided, they just survived the Jive, if you will, and they avoided the arrival of the domesticated lifestyle and stayed out in the open steppe, in the freedom. And out there, they sort of continued to evolve and transform to something else. And you have then obviously like the Corduware, the Yamnaya and all this stuff. So maybe you can kind of give me a kind of preview of the mental model for this as these people begin to swoop into the West, how you understand these people forming. Like, were they all Yamnaya, black-haired, tall, weird-looking, sort of like strange? Does the Ratlin guy with 80% of the DNA in Ireland, does that mean that they were like ginger-haired, blue-eyed guys? What do you understand from all of this?
Basically, a lot of the 19th century science, which the Nazis were influenced by, is correct, actually. And the Nazis didn't even say that the Germans were a pure race. They knew that they had mixture from a non-Aryan, as they used, source. One of the main things that's changed is we don't use the term Aryan to describe the Proto-Indo-Europeans anymore, because the people who describe themselves as Aryans are now understood as existing over 1,000 years after Proto-Indo-European was spoken. And they lived on Central Asian steppe. They were called, they spoke Proto-Indo-Iranian, and they would have referred to themselves as Aryans. And then they became the Arya of India and the Aryans in Arya in Iran. But because that was so old and they didn't have carbon dating, they kind of conflated the Central Asian with Eastern European, Indo-Europeans. But now we know the real story of the origins of the Proto-Indo-European race begin 6,500 years ago, quite a long time ago, in the Neolithic, when a whole load of different hunter-gatherer groups, quite divergent, on the rivers in Eastern Europe and Ukraine and South Russia, the Don, the Volga, the Dnieper, and some of them on the west have a lot of Western hunter-gatherer ancestry. Some of them have a lot on the east of Volga, especially mostly Eastern hunter-gatherer ancestry. And towards the Caucasus Mountains, there's a group of hunter-gatherers living who descend from Caucasus hunter-gatherers. And additionally, there's also some further up the Volga who have additional Siberian ancestry. And all these groups come together, and they also pick up a bit of early European farmer DNA as well, because by that time, those people are sort of hanging around in Eastern Europe. And they mix together and form the very divergent along the river valleys in that core area near Crimea, and they make a new race, which we call Western steppe herders, although they weren't really all steppe herding yet, but they were pioneering at that stage a new way of life which didn't exist before, and that's what caused these diverse races to form an ethnogenesis, a new race, the Indo-European race. About 1,000 years later, 5,500 years ago, they had started burying their dead in pits. Now, earlier than that, they had already started building kurgans, barrows, but the addition of a pit grave resulted in the Russian archaeologists referring to that period of their history as Yamnaya. It means pit relating to pits. So it's not a new Yamnaya, not a new race. They formed about 1,000 years before the pits, but Yamnaya just refers to the existence of pits. But this same race spread across a lot part of Eastern Europe, and not all of them had pit graves, but they're the same people. Like corded ware come from this same race, and corded ware didn't make pits. They're defined as having pots with cords on them. But around 5,500 years ago, Yamnaya are significant, not because of their pits, but because they start to harness dairy. And already their ancestors have been herding on the steppe now. So previously, these hunter-gatherers have been limited on the steppe to the river valleys. But suddenly, they start going out into the grasslands with their domesticated animals that they picked up somewhere from the near. Most of these animals were domesticated in the Near East: sheep, cattle, goats. But one type is not domesticated in the Near East. It was domesticated there in Ukraine. And that's a horse. So they took local horses and domesticated them. And they were drinking their milk. They were drinking horse milk, sheep milk, and cow milk 5,500 years ago. And some of them had evolved lactose tolerance. Not many, maybe 10, 20% of them. But it was the beginning of this thing. And they...
If you don't mind me asking, did they evolve that because they just started to chug? They were like, lads, this food of the gods here, they just start drinking and their stomachs begin to like generate it? Or is there like a general selection like, do we even know about that?
All mammals are born lactose tolerant. They're all born with lactase persistence to digest milk, and they all lose it as they get older because they don't need it and they're going to switch to drinking. They're not on their mother's teat anymore. They have other foods. But obviously, some mutation occurred in a group of them that they were able to drink milk for longer, and it was so advantageous that it started to increase in frequency because of the selection pressures. So by that time, 1,000 years ago, it reached around 20%, but it goes up and up and up. By the Iron Age in Ireland and Britain, it's 50%. But the early Iron Age, it's 50%. By the end of the Iron Age, it's 75%. So it's going, even since in medieval times, it's going up as well. So it's got now to the highest level it's ever been, but it's constantly going up because it's always useful to be able to get nutrients from milk all through your life. But these people also, the first evidence of horse riding is around them. So they have domesticated their horses, and it's possible that horses had already been domesticated at another time in history for meat by a different race further east on the steppe. Who their horses were just for food though, and those horses don't contribute to modern horse genes. But these people rode their horses, and all horses today descend from their horses. And the European people domesticated horses, and after that, suddenly they explode across Eurasia. They spread all the Afanassievo culture goes all the way out to the Altai, thousands of miles across the steppe. Near to China, and then you've got people who are like second-degree relatives or like first cousins or something, very, very close relatives living on the Altai and in Slovakia, so thousands of years apart. And there's complete genetic homogeneity between these regions. So although they started off 6,500 years ago from the mixture of all these different races, after that they don't mix with other people very much, and they don't want to. They start becoming homogenous. But one group of them, the Yamnaya, actually end up losing out. The northern border, their cousins of the corded ware culture, take Yamnaya women, and then the corded ware culture is formed from Yamnaya women and these other steppe herders from the north, and they have different lineages from the Yamnaya, and they're the ones who really are the stars of the story, because they then mix with the globular amphora people in Poland to their west, because to the south they have Yamnaya in Ukraine, and to the north in Poland they have globular amphora people. Again, they mix with both.
Sorry to interrupt, but the globular amphora were Neolithic farmers who were mixing with the Scandinavians, hunter-gatherers, as you said. So they were actually developing blondism and stuff like this. Okay.
Some of them had blonde hair, yeah. Okay. The Yamnaya and the corded ware people would have looked the same prior to that. The Yamnaya and corded ware had much stronger, bigger bodies than farmers. Their genes are associated with physical strength in modern Europeans today. They were taller and more robust. Their skulls also had some of the archaic features we associated with like cavemen, because they had quite a lot of like high hunter-gatherer DNA, so like stronger brow ridges, and broad cheekbones, and strong jaws. They look like, robust, scary guys, more so than the Neolithic farmers to their west or the Middle Eastern people to the south. But phenotypically, otherwise phenotypes from the genes we can tell, most of them would have had brown eyes. They did have genes from Western hunter-gatherers associated with blue eyes, but it doesn't seem like that was a common. Most of them didn't have blue eyes. Some of them could have. Genes for red hair were found widely among them, but very few of them, so far none have been found where we think it's likely that those genes were expressed. However, there must have been some ginger ones, because if every single person in like some cemeteries is a red hair gene carrier, but at least some would have ended up with two variants of the gene. You need two variants to end up expressing it with red hair. But red hair genes were widely disseminated among them, so we should assume that some of them had red hair. But for the most part, they were brown and black-haired. And their skin tone was darker than modern Irish people, closer to modern Italians, some southern Europeans. So you can imagine someone with the Scandinavian-style, robust like features, or some Russian boxer or a British football hooligan style, like broad skull look, like scary, like something like Vinnie Jones or Tyson Fury or something like that, with a darker complexion,
Italian,
more
Tyson
like an
Fury.
Italian. And some of them could have been red-haired. So don't think that they all have black hair, because it's possible. And some of them have brown hair. A lot of them have brown hair. So they wouldn't have looked like Middle Easterners today, because they had. And Middle Easterners don't have this hunter-gatherer DNA. Middle Easterners don't have brown hair usually. So some people want to describe them as looking like Indians or Middle Easterners. That's really not true, because they're far more robust, far larger, and they're also brown and red hair, and even in some rare cases, and of course they're just different faces. The closest relatives to corded ware people today are in the North Atlantic region. So the Irish, Norwegians, Icelanders, that area is actually a very higher than anywhere else. But earlier steppe herders like Yamnaya have quite close affinities also with Dagestanis. And they also have red hair quite regularly. So you can try and imagine somewhere between Irish, Icelandic, and Dagestani. You might be arriving at something like a Yamnaya phenotype or a corded ware phenotype.
So Khabib and Connor was like some type of mythical 1,000-year-old ancient brother war. Oh my God, that is crazy.
In a way, that is, yeah. If you mixed Khabib and Connor together with a face thing, it might get something closer to what they look like than either of them look like. Because of course, modern Caucasians have significant extra Near Eastern DNA that the actual Yamnaya people would never have had. So they look more Middle Eastern, and Irish people have extra Western farmer DNA. So both of them have diverged, but yeah, somewhere between them would probably be accurate.
I can't wait.
But once they mix with these.
Could I ask just something quickly? Again, I keep interrupting you, but there's just so much flying past me at the moment. So one thing because obviously people are probably familiar with this on my channel because I talk about this. Ireland has an enormous amount of DNA from these people, like close to 80 to 90%. Obviously, like the farmers are mixed in with that as well. But basically, like Ireland are almost like a pristine, perhaps example of this original wave, which is quite fascinating. So these guys,
well, not quite, because I was just trying to get to the Bell-Beaker people. Because the Irish people come from Bell-Beaker people. So the corded ware people have, once they've mixed with these globular amphora farmer people, and then after that, a second mixing event happens where some of these corded ware people mix with French megalith people, and they form a new culture called the Bell-Beaker culture, which lives around the Rhine. And then an invasion of the British Isles from the Rhine occurs around 4,500 years ago, and it goes from Britain into Ireland. And that is the people that the Irish and British get most of their Indo-European DNA from.
So do I have the mental model wrong? Because as I understood it, I've got it in my head. We're in Ukraine. This is where these hands are here. And we have Or1A and Or1B. And Or1A goes up and becomes corded ware, and Or1B goes down into old Europe, which is like Romania, and they begin to conquer. And then they swoop in, and then they meet each other essentially in Germany, or like, around about the lower Alps up into Germany. And then the Or1B continue to go over into Western Europe. So that's an incorrect mental model from what I understand.
Not quite. Yeah, it's not quite right. So the early Western steppe herder groups in like 6,500 years ago were associated with a number of different archaeological cultures. One of them is Sredni Stog, which I think is the most important because it's got more of the traits that become significant for archaeology of the Indo-Europeans later. Later on, like at the time of the Yamnaya, and the Yamnaya have some important developments that are associated with later Indo-European dispersals. The Yamnaya never go further west than Hungary, the Hungarian plain. Whereas to their north, in like the northern part of Ukraine and parts of Poland, the corded ware culture, and parts of Russia as well, they expand westward into Germany, and they have mixed with the Yamnaya. They've taken Yamnaya women, and later on, the corded ware expand south and replace the Yamnaya completely. They destroy the Yamnaya. The whole of the Yamnaya territories get replaced by R1A lineages. The Yamnaya lost. They weren't the ones who spread Indo-Europeans. It was all corded ware doing it. The only languages that may be direct descendants from Yamnaya today are possibly Greek, Albanian, and Armenian. Armenian is definitely a Yamnaya invasion, because a Yamnaya crossed over the Caucasus and invaded Armenia. The Yamnaya also provided the Hittite language. So the Hittites descended from Yamnaya, who invaded Anatolia. And also they probably brought Greek as well. But all the others, the Celtic, the Germanic, the Aryan languages like Indian, the Iranian, the Slavic, the Baltic, all come from corded ware, including Latin. So the Bell-Beaker, there were some corded ware is mostly R1A, but there was one form of R1B in it as well. And that R1B, the guys of the R1B are the ones who broke off and became the Bell-Beakers, which is why Western Europe now is dominated by R1B. It wasn't an R1B found much around Yamnaya. It was more associated with corded ware in Bohemia, around Czechia. And it becomes extremely dominant all across Europe because the Bell Beakers invade Iberia, dominate it, destroy 100% of the lineages of the farmers there, replaced by R1b. Britain was all I2, Ireland was all I2. Not long after, a couple of hundred years, all R1b. They just wiped the slate clean and completely change it. So this is what Irish people come from, these Bell Beaker people who were living around the Rhine and crossed over into the British Isles around 4,500 years ago.
So we were talking about the phenotype and how they look. Now, one thing that you notice in Ireland is that if you go further west, people get darker, and you also see more red hair. It's the same in Scotland, you know, like the English, the Scandinavians, they'll be very blonde. Blondism is quite heavy in them. Ireland, it's there, but it's not that significant. Like if I look back at my school photos, you were describing hair colors of like the Indo-Europeans, for example, and it's exactly this. Almost all of us are brown haired, like people have hair like me. I'm brunette, especially when I was younger, I was much lighter brunette. Everybody was like around about that same hair tone. And there was one blonde girl, and then there was about 7, 8 redheads, and then there was like 1 or 2 proper like pitch black, and everybody else then in between was like blonde, brunette. And in Ireland, and if you go further to the west, you start to see less blondism and more like really, really dark features. Like you start to see the Black Irish, which is like just very, very, very dark features, which could be maybe the farmers, or maybe that comes in with the Bell Beakers from the Indo-Europeans or something like this. Now, since like we're essentially a remnant of that first wave, is like, are we seeing maybe closer to what their phenotype was like? And blondism comes in then afterwards when the Celts do all this sexual selection, and then the Germans are doing all the sexual selection. Obviously, those groups are actually later incidences or something like this. So, like, you go to West Ireland, like, what do you think you might be seeing there?
So the Bell Beaker people invading the British Isles would have been already have more instances of blonde hair and red hair than the steppe people on the steppe, because already that process has started. So some of the people coming in, I mean, whilst I say this, when the corded ware invade the Polish farmer, the globular amphora, in that instance, the farmers are lighter than the steppe people.
Oh wow!
But in that case, that's the only case that happens. Almost every other case after that, the steppe people are lighter than the farmers. So in Ireland, the steppe people coming in would have been lighter, have lighter hair, lighter skin color, not necessarily lighter eyes, because blue eyes were already common all around the British Isles. So, but I don't think that hair color would have been significantly different between them, that you would they would have noticed it very much. Like for the most part, most of the farmers in Ireland would have brown and black hair, and most of the invading Bell Beaker people would have brown and black hair. Some of them would have red and blonde hair as well, but a minority. But that phenotype of red and blonde hair, those two phenotypes will increase over the Bronze Age and over the Iron Age, as well as lactase persistence. Those are things being selected for very, very strongly, constantly for thousands of years. So whether that's from environmental necessity or just sexual selection, or a combination of the two, I'm not sure. I also think that it's quite likely blondism, not red hair, but blondism is possibly being selected for indirectly as a process of selecting for lactase persistence. I don't know if it's sure. This is just my speculative theory I've put out there on the internet, but because lactase persistence is a neotenous trait, meaning it's a trait associated with childhood that you're selecting for to endure into adulthood. Many neotenous traits are being selected for in modern times. For example, the things that we associate with women being beautiful are mostly neotenous traits, because beautiful women is associated with youth, because youth is associated with fertility. If a woman is young, looks young, she's more likely to be able to conceive children, so she's more likely to be sexually attractive to a human male. So we've been selecting increasingly for women to have larger eyes like children, or have large, smoother skin, things like that, less wrinkly. So actually women are getting more beautiful over time, not less. I mean, it might not always seem that way, but over the long period of history, they are. I think most of us would find Stone Age women unattractive. They look too robust. They look too, too chunky.
Mommy, spank you. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, but that would mean that maybe, because often people say, "Oh, I was blonde as a child, but then my hair went dark." Well, that's because blondism is Yeah, it's very common, and even in other cultures which don't have Indo-European ancestry or farmer ancestry, like in Middle East, even you can find children like in Palestine with blonde hair, but they will have jet black Arab-looking face and everything when they're, well, not black face, but I mean black hair and beard when they're old, because blondism is generally a neotenous trait. It's found in children, it disappears. But it seems in Europeans we selected for it to continue into adults. And maybe that was because of it. It was like when we were selecting for, maybe it's something somehow connected to the genes associated with milk drinking. I've heard some people say I'm onto something there, but I don't really understand the science of the genetics well enough to say if I'm right.
That's a really, really interesting idea, because you're talking about polygenetic selection, and there's no reason to assume that stuff wouldn't happen. So for anybody in the audience who might not follow, like if I talk maybe about red hair, there might be one gene that switches on and off hair color for redness or something like this. I think it's to do with eumelanin, so like it's some type of color. But IQ, for example, has 10 genes, we'll say. So it needs like a synapse speed, so how fast synapse flashes in your brain. Maybe it's to do with like use of choline. So there's all these like little sort of chemical traits, and you need all of them switched on for IQ to go up, or all of them influence IQ. So if you're favorable in all these, your IQ will go up. So in this case, like if you choose for drinking milk, it may mean that it's like a lactose thing, but it might also mean that like you use more calcium. It might also mean that you suppress vitamin D, and all these weird side effects have to happen. And this may actually lead to a general lightening. So the mental model perhaps that we're suggesting here is that this bizarre combination of farming, the grain farmer, early European farmers, which leads to stability in all this, and the capacity for lightning and whatever that encourages farming, is also married to like pastoral milk drinking herders, and then they become like pastoral farmers. And then in that context, weirdly, this massive lactose tolerance farming lightning process takes place, and then Northern Europe just like rapidly starts to select for these people, which really does make sense. That's an interesting idea, a really interesting mental model.
It must be something like that, because I repeat again, the same exact processes of selection occurred separately in the British Isles and Scandinavia without influence from each other. So, and that means something was happening culturally in both places that caused the same exact selection pressures. And I'm guessing it's the introduction of these diets, as you say, combined with the general stability, gloomy weather.
And like even thinking about this, again, I think of the Celtic disease, which is hemochromatosis, where we generate too much iron. Why do we generate too much iron? Because when you're drinking a fuckload of calcium, excuse my French, the iron and calcium compete inside the body. So when you're drinking a lot of milk, you actually don't absorb as much iron from your food. So the Irish, or the Gaels, generate more iron naturally, which actually is a big problem, because if we stop drinking calcium and we start eating very high meat, for example, we actually store too much iron and get iron problems and these types of things. And so that's, again, related to diet, related to the genetics. That guy, the Ratlin man.
Some Yamnaya children have been found to have anemia because they had too much dairy. If you have too much, as you say, it prevents iron absorption from overconsumption of dairy. And some Yamna children were drinking so much dairy that they actually became anemic. So maybe by the time they're in Ireland, the Beaker folk have started to develop this counteractions, or they can continue to have high levels of dairy without becoming anemic. So it's like already a selection. And now there's another problem with the Celtic disease or whatever, when it needs to be resolved. Or
that's it. The Ratlin man had it. They checked his genetics. And he has hemochromatosis, and it's like, what? That's bizarre. Like he's us. It's very, very crazy.
Yeah.
There's also another couple of things here. So obviously, like the red hair is like the highest in Scotland and Ireland. So the Gaels. Things like Rh negative blood. So like obviously I'm going to take this as like we're descended from the aliens, and yous are all the Untermensch that came after us. You're lucky. English are like maybe one step away from us. That's okay. You're kind of just there. But do you have any idea on like Rh negative, like why that happened?
I don't know about Rh negative, but red hair, as I say, was a trait. Is actually a widespread trait in many races in ancient or prehistoric West Eurasia. It was present in the Yamna, it was present in Cordoba, as I say, and it was present in the Beaker folk who came over. But what I think has happened for its selection in Northern Europe is that it appears to have some relationship to depigmentation. And because the worst levels of sunlight in all of Europe are pretty much in Northern Ireland, probably that's where the strongest selection pressure for lightening of the skin. The fairest people in all the world are in Northern Ireland. And also there's a lot of gingers there. The Yamnaya weren't very fair, but they did have the ginger hair sometimes, but I think they didn't need it so much. But once you selected for lighter skin, I think somehow, and as I say, I'm not a geneticist, so I don't fully understand this process, but I think somehow the process of selecting for lighter skin inadvertently also selected for red hair, because red hair is related to depigmentation.
I think I do know this one, although I'm LARPing as a geneticist here. But I said eumelanin, I think is the name of it. So it's a gene that switches on something called eumelanin, and that lightens skin, so it makes your skin paler, and it also takes the pigmentation out of your hair, and it makes it red. It also makes your lips red. So that same thing, and then there's a different way. There's a different form of melanin or a different pathway, and if that one switches, you get blonde hair. And you can actually be tanned with blonde hair, but the red one produces freckles, and the lip pigmentation, red hair, and paleness. So that's why when you see gingers, they tend to be very pale, and they actually almost don't tan at all. This type of thing. So that could be.
Swedes tan better than Brits. I noticed when I was there, they can get a golden tan that I generally won't get, like a more pasty.
Well,
complexion.
I was again wondering about the hunter-gatherer I haplogroup theory. Is like, do they still have the genes from them? That's why they tan well. But it's that's probably a bit
maybe. They do have high hunter-gatherer ancestry. The highest in Europe is in not Scandinavia, but in the Baltic countries like Lithuania, Estonia, that region. They have very high levels of native hunter-gatherer ancestry.
They're a bit swarthy. They're very tall, very big.
They can be tall, yeah. They can, but they can also be blonde as well. Yeah. But it's interesting area.
Two things I'll ask you, and then I'll let you go, because I think we've got so much here that's fantastic. Obviously the Celts, and then I want to talk to you a little bit about religion, paganism, tradition, and how we model all this, because the Celts is fundamentally going to take us into the story of the Irish identity. Victorian age, when the Germans were trying to figure out, are we the Aryans? They were trying to figure out who we are, looking at all this type of stuff. They were constructing an identity. There was a lot of stuff going on in that century with Wagner and all this, the lifting up of new identities. Ireland, in the middle of this, have the likes of Yeats, have the Celtic revival, have many people working around this as well, and they construct this notion that, like, all right, how do we separate ourselves from these English lads? And we start to say, well, we're Celts, they're Germanics, we're Celts, and we're related to the French, and we're these people identified by Julius Caesar. Now, the DNA has actually been quite shocking, like very shocking, and for several reasons. One of the myths that was held up at the time is the Irish aren't white, and that actually turns out that we've an enormous amount of Indo-European DNA, which is fascinating. And then maybe we got all big in our boots about that, but then it turns out that we're not Celts. The Celts are only maybe 20% of who we are, which kind of throws us in a bit of a fix. So, and it turns out the English are more Celtic than us, which is like, I don't know, not something I'm going to say down in the pub anytime soon. Let me put it this way. So how do we model this? Because this really, really bothers people. It's very hard to get around their head. I understand it as bell beakers come in, and then on the continent, the people who stay back there generate something new, and then that floods in. But was that a conquest? Was that a professional army coming in? Was that just trade? How did that work?
So the paper that reveals a lot about the Celtic origins in northwestern Europe is Patterson and colleagues 2023. So it's fresh still, last year. And what it shows is that before I say what it shows, actually, I'll say where the Celtic culture began. Celtic culture began from bell beaker culture as well. Just as the Irish come from bell beakers around the Rhine area that went northwest, some of the bell beaker people went south towards Central Europe. And in Central Europe, they mixed in a really complicated process with other people in the area. I don't want to go into because it's too much to say. But basically, the consequence was that they emerged in the Bronze Age as the dominant culture of Europe. They controlled the trade of salt from the Alps. Salt was like gold. It was so important because everyone needed to preserve food for the winter, and you can only do that with salt. So everyone in the whole bloody world, as far as you know it, needs salt, and you've got it. You can make a lot of power with that. Plus, you've got copper in the mountains, and everyone needs copper and tin to make bronze. So all the elites of all of Europe depend on these trader things. So the Celtic culture became extremely influential and dominant, growing out of that region of South Germany, Austria, Czechia, Switzerland, and parts of Eastern France. That whole band, it was a big, and it starts to, by the time you get into the historical period where the Romans are writing about the barbarians to the north, this culture isn't the dominant culture anymore. Romans are taking over. The Romans replaced the Celts as the dominant culture of Europe in that sense. But they're writing about a world where Celtic is spoken in Iberia, in Ireland, in Britain, in Gaul, in lots of Germany still. Even southern Germany might have still, before the Germanic expansions, lots of Germany remained like that. But anyway, the Patterson paper showed that how this culture influenced the British Isles and when. So instead of an invasion like the Bell-Beaker one, where you just see 4,500 years ago a massive genetic replacement happening across Britain and Ireland, this one is much more subtle and slow. So beginning around 1000 BC, so 3,000 years ago, you start to see a trickle of French DNA coming into Britain. And this goes on for 200-300 years. And then it stops. And then after that time, Britain remains, I'm sorry to talk about Britain and not Ireland, but it's basically the story is combined. The two islands are adjacent to each other and the continent. So the way it happens is usually hopscotch, Britain, continent, Britain, Ireland. So then Iron Age Britain cuts itself off and there's no gene flow between Britain and the continent during that period. But at that time, Britain becomes very, very, very much culturally the same as France. The material culture is what's happening in France. So we must assume that when we start to see Celtic artifacts manufactured in Britain and Ireland, that they are Celtic. And that only occurs after this trickle. But what happens with the trickle is, although the trickle itself only affects Southeast England, it wasn't England at the time because England means English people, Southeast Britain, the people of South Britain sort of spread to Northern Britain and Northern Britain into Ireland. And then, so actually this original Celtic signal, which is just French DNA, because the modern French people are pretty much identical to Iron Age Gauls. They haven't really changed that much.
Wow.
Although you'd assume with the occupation of different peoples like the Franks, and the Moors, but they didn't really leave a big genetic change, and nor did the Romans. So the French are pretty much still Gauls. And the word Gaul is Germanic. Is the same word as Welsh. It means non-Germanic, Romanized foreigner. So it's not related to Galli. The Galli and Gaul are completely different words. It's just coincidental that they sound alike. Galli is the Roman word for the Celtic people, but the Gaul is a Frankish word from wall. Anyway, so this French signal comes into Ireland, and we don't really know how. The paper doesn't actually say how much of that DNA is in Ireland, but people have used samples and amateur geneticists on the internet to calculate their own idea of how much it is. Low ballers say Irish people are about 8% from that, and high ballers say 29%. So someone like the Cisalpine Gaul account says around 20%. But yeah, it's going to be somewhere between 10 and 30, maybe 20%. I don't know. It could be, yeah, as I say, some people say 8%. So I'm not really sure. But the point is, the big bulk of Irish ancestry is from the first Indo-European invasion to Ireland, not the second. And the other point to make is that this Gaulish DNA, or it's Bronze Age Gaulish DNA coming into Britain, doesn't go in directly into Ireland. It comes indirectly from British people. So British people from Britain, probably Scotland, what's now Scotland, moving into Ireland. And that means that we have to imagine why the languages changed and why they adopted new material culture traditions from the continent without a population replacement. Was it because there was a Norman style model with an elite dominance, like the new Celtic speaking elites, enforcing a Celtic culture on the people? Or was it just they just thought it was really cool over there and everyone wanted to be part of this whole big network of trade that spanned all the way to Anatolia? Because you have like the Galatians in the Bible, there's Celtic speaking people in what's now Turkey, all the way from Turkey to Ireland, people speaking common languages that could probably understand and trading long. Maybe there was a big economic incentive to belong to this Celtic world, because as far as people were concerned in those times, Celt was like EU. Like it wasn't an ethnicity, it was like a common culture for all of Europe.
So that's actually something that I find quite handy to think about, is thinking about like American cultural hegemony, where you go to like Afghanistan and they're watching TikToks of like some American influencer, or they watch movies, they watch movies and all this, and they can all speak English. No matter where you go in the world, you go to Latin America, you go to Japan, people can speak English because of the power of American hegemony. So was it something like this where the Celts kind of had a golden age, and they generated their culture, very heavy, loving metallurgy and all this. And it becomes important to be integrated with this. And obviously the people who are high status within that culture probably have like breeding rights, and they spread out very, very well. And there is a bit of elite dominance, probably is like competition and war, but it's obviously not population replacement. And that just leads to this weird, hidden from history, something that we just could have never known from the historical record, but it implies that something like that might have happened. And that led to that kind of reshaping of the cultural landscape, interestingly, less so than the genetics. And the Irish then, even though we might have been more Bell Beaker, we sort of remember ourselves as that, because that's the sort of like most recent imprint, if you will. Is that the correct way to mental model it? Again, mental models, it comes down to here.
Yeah, I think something like that's probably true. It's hard as well to know a lot. I mean, the problem with Celtic as a cultural thing is that when I can talk about like the ancient Bronze Age Celtic phenomenon in terms of the archaeological spreads and the genetic spread. But then when we're looking at like the Celtic language families, the only really well attested ones are the insular ones. So the ones from Britain and Ireland. And those are already probably highly divergent from the ones in their attested forms in medieval Gaelic. It's already highly divergent from anything spoken in Bronze Age Europe. So we're like, our focus and understanding of what Celtic is very much skewed towards what is actually a peripheral and perhaps not very significant in the Bronze Age part of the Celtic world. It's at the end. It's like if our entire understanding of American culture ended up being what's in Alaska or something like that. You know what I mean? It would be misleading because not everything in Alaska reflects everything elsewhere. That's probably a very clumsy analogy. I'm trying
maybe we like rediscover Canada in 5,000 years and we're like, wow, these guys are crazy. And it's like, I don't know what the Americans like. Imagine the Americans being like, we're remembered by the Canadians as something like this. I guess there's a couple of questions then about this, because again, mental models philosophy always comes back to this. The Irish, we have this identity as the Celts, and it gives us, like, because you want an identity to assert yourself and feel confident about yourself and feel that you're special, and you like, it's very difficult to come across something like genetics that starts to take that away from you, and it's very fascinating even being on the internet right now, and everybody's like throwing around like, you're not white, or this, and you notice identity is such a big deal with people, and it's something that's very emotionally intense. I find that very, very fascinating. And this is
Irish is an identity, isn't it? Irish is itself an identity. It's an ancient identity, and it's well attested, more so than most of the identities in the world. Like, you've got Irish people written about well over 1,000 years ago. You've got Irish literature, literary Irish sources, like going back to like 1,500 years ago. So why does it need to be tied up with unrelated people in Bronze Age Germany?
Yeah, and even like the idea of us being bell beakers is in some sense even more fascinating if you think about it, because it's true as well. Yeah. So it's very grounded and strong.
We don't actually know to the extent to the extent to which the Irish culture of the Celtic Irish culture was from pre-Celtic bell beaker. Yeah, because we don't have enough of the continental Celtic stuff to really pass. Like, most people who like interested in mythology, if we're going to get into religion later, like Celtic mythology is besides like the archaeological sources and Roman sources on the religion of the Gauls in Roman times, it's almost entirely based on Irish and Welsh medieval literature. So, but we actually don't know how much of the myths of Ireland are much older. Because some of them include things like Newgrange and the art things, parts of the Irish landscape that can't have been imported from a continental source. They must have invented in Ireland. So the question is, were they invented after the Celtic languages came to Ireland, or were they there already? They may be more. What I'm saying is, Irish may have the Irish identity may have deeper roots in Ireland than Celticness.
Yes, which is fascinating, and I think this is a kind of a challenge for our generation now. Is that, like, obviously there's a lot of political crisis going on with identity, and we're probably going to have to reforge it in many of the ways that the people of the Victorian age did. And it's something that you kind of have to do every now and again, just to clean things up mentally. And it really brings us on to your project, you know, because so much so about your genetic project. Like you talk about paganism all the time. You're talking about Wodan out there and all this. And you're obviously working hard to rehabilitate the British identity and British traditionalism and the understanding of, like, I guess you say English. I'm not sure exactly how you'd see it. More so than anything, I notice you're just trying to reconstruct the stories and sort of assert that it's like, because I've spoken to you about several things over the years. One of them, for example, is like all these interesting mistakes that come out of the identity. The British Israelism. Do we come from the Middle East and all this? And you would be like, and you'd sit down, you'd have the same sort of talk. You'd be like, listen, there's so much in our own history. There's this really weird desire to romanticize and escape to like some biblical history, it's not just a bash necessarily at the Bible. You also say like the thing like, oh, the British came from Troy, and you're like, you don't need that. You know, that was something that maybe the medievals did to create a prestigious identity. But weirdly, you dig into your history, and it's actually it's fine as it is. It's actually in some sense you need to affirm it. Interestingly, this is a critique of Nietzsche that I'll throw as a compliment to you. I notice Nietzsche has a little bit of a trait where he's trying to run away from the German identity. Carl Jung would speak about this. Carl Jung would say Nietzsche wanted to talk about Wodan and German paganism, but he couldn't do it because he saw German as like below him, as uncivilized. So he ran off to Dionysus. He ran off to the god of the Greeks because it was prestigious and mighty and cool. And he had many traits like this. Like he was like, I'm Polish. He wasn't Polish. He's like, I love the French. I hate everything German. And it's this weird thing where he can't affirm what he is. He's really struggling with that like core identity. It's a very big modern crisis we're seeing in Europeans. And you're going almost in the entire opposite direction, where you're like no disrespect to the Greeks or anything to this, or no disrespect to the Romans, but like I'm digging roots here, and I'm going to figure out what we are, and I'm going to try to resurrect that and use that as a foundation for how we see ourselves and all this. So what are your comments on that, and how do you see what I'm framing?
Absolutely. You've touched on a core thing of my project and what I'm trying to do. Nietzsche said in one point, we must face ourselves. We are Hyperboreans. But then he didn't manage to always do that. But he sometimes said, I will know you, unknown God. And I always thought that the unknown God that he couldn't face is not Dionysus. It was Wotan. And even this thing in German, it's not uniquely German. It's found in medieval sources. It's not uniquely modern. But I mean, before Nietzsche, you had Goethe and Faust. Goethe says to Mephisto, what happened to your two ravens? And he says, oh, I've updated to a new style. So obviously Mephisto is Wotan and intended to be like two ravens. And then where does Goethe go? He flies off with Mephisto to ancient Greece to see the ways of the Greeks in that story, in Faust 2. But this problem of Northern Europeans began as soon as we were even literate, because when do the British start saying, like Geoffrey Monmouth starts saying they're Trojan? That's in the first British text, basically, the history of the kings of Britain. When did the Irish start talking about the Scotty being an Egyptian queen or whatever? This is the earliest text that we have. And when do the Icelanders start saying, oh, Odin was actually a king from Turkey or something like this? The earliest Icelandic text. It's like, we've got literature now. We can record our histories just like the Jews and the Greeks did. So what are they? Well, these guys are now Christians, and they don't want to celebrate paganism, so they've got to rehabilitate paganism, and not because they think paganism is shameful and they're embarrassed about their pagan past now because they're Christians, but they also don't want to be ashamed of their past. They want to have glorious origins. So they say, oh, well, we must be descended from the Egyptians or the Greeks or the Jews or one of these ancient peoples that are written in these texts, because we are great too. Like, come on, why? Surely we must be in this history, because the assumption that these great texts, which the Bible specifically is holy, would exclude an important part of history was not really fathomable. So everything of history must be in these books. And since we're important, we must be in these books. So it's just a case of finding where we are. But now we have something more accurate and interesting than any of those ancient tomes. That is the story written in our blood and written in the soil through archaeology. And now we understand the language of the soil and the language of the blood. We can tell those stories properly. So that's what I want to do, because I think it's way more interesting. To give the Egyptians are a great civilization, for example, but to give an example to compare, like the pyramids were built only in one river valley for just a few hundred years. I can't remember. It's like less than 600 years. I don't know, 400 years or something like that. There was a little revival by some black people after in the lower, higher up further south on the river, thousands of years later. But that doesn't count. Those aren't the same pyramids. The original pyramids, just one river valley. The Barrow, which started way earlier, in Ukraine, spread all the way from China to Ireland, and this is an equivalent grave monument, and the languages of Egypt completely died out, except maybe Coptic Christians have some derivative of ancient Egyptian, perhaps, which is an insignificant and has no cultural influence anywhere. Indo-European language is spoken by billions of people around the world. It's the dominant language family. The Barrows went everywhere. The blood went everywhere. Hardly any people descend from ancient Egyptians. Like, if you look at it in terms of like history, the first language spoken in space was Russian. That's Indo-European. The first language spoken on the moon, English. That's Indo-European origin. The first the first people to encapsulate the entire globe and understand its entirety were Indo-European speakers. The people who made the horse, which was the dominant form of technology of transport technology, all around the world for thousands of years, for like 6,000 years or something, 5,000 years at least, until someone invented the train. It was also British as Indo-European, and then the car was invented by a German. It's like, it's all these guys, and they can't stop winning. They can't stop winning. They can't stop spreading. And everyone will say, "Well, we want to be ancient Egyptians. We want to be." I'm like, why? What did they do? Yeah. What's their influence now? It's nothing compared to what the Indo-Europeans did. It's like insignificant. It's got some pointy rocks like built thousands of years ago. That like the guys building the Barrows, they're the heroes that whose story needs to be told now.
Like amazing. Look, it's an amazing thing, because I often say people are very black-pilled today. They look around, they say, Jesus, the state of this world, it's all over, we're all screwed. But just like we were saying about the genomic revolution, artificial intelligence, even many of the grand crazy projects that are going on, like getting shut in our houses and stuff like this, like we do actually live in a very fascinating and interesting time. And looking at this, I don't think people have quite grasped how enormous what happened when we sequenced the genome was for specifically what we're speaking about, because none of this was known. This was all just darkness. It was all just hidden. And I read about Irish myths. I remember reading them growing up. Like I remember growing up before this was knowledge, and I would read about the Irish myths, and I would see all the stuff you're talking about. They would be like, well, Ireland had the Partholons, and they were descended from Noah, and then Noah creates these guys, and then these guys, and then the Tuatha come, and you're looking at all that stuff, and you're seeing how these people back then, all of a sudden now, I can see how these people were just trying to rationalize within their world model, and they were trapped within their world model, and they had to make the story to make sense, and they had to give themselves a positive identity that was connected to the biblical story, or else none of it would have made sense. And then now, all of a sudden, in 10 years, as you said, the most amazing thing you could imagine, going into this, the meat, figuring out a mystical language inside of it. Like, that's just so insane. We figured out a magic code that lives inside your flesh that tells us stories that haven't been written down in language and have been forgotten to man since the beginning of time. We're seeing past history. We're expanding the boundaries of history itself. That is fucking nuts. And again, with the Irish side, we're discovering so many crazy things about ourselves. Oh, well, you thought you were Celtic. I have bigger news for you, my friends. There's like crazier things going on.
You've got to be like those Irish monks in the way that they were like, this is the new information paradigm and we need to build a narrative within it. Well, now is here's another precipice, a new information paradigm. Build the narrative of who you are, because now's the time.
Like 100%. And I notice you doing this, and like there's obviously many other people, and it's blistering how fast it moves, because you're there and you construct the model, and then just new information comes up and you're like, fuck, I have to put it together. I think one I heard was Indo-Europeans came in and invaded. Some people said actually there was this big Black Death. Reich found all the bubonic plague inside people, and it's like, well, was there this giant die-off? And you're like, how do you adjust to this stuff so fast? The Celtic thing that came out last year, like that's just brand new, that we're all trying to figure this stuff out. So it's very interesting. It's very interesting how emotional this is, how important it is for us to have an identity, how it's tied to religion. Maybe this is the thing I'll ask you to end on, like your kind of thoughts on that. But basically this is happening right now. There's a remodeling going on. It's happening across the world. It's real. we're opening up, we're filling in shadows itself with new knowledge. And yeah, like it's kind of a renaissance moment, as cringe as it is to say something like that. I think it's very valuable to pay attention to this. So I've seen you construct and work with paganism, traditionalism, and you're looking back at obviously your ancestors, the Anglo-Saxons, and you're looking at their Wodan and all this. And do you see this as related? Like obviously reconstructing the identity and the history. How does that move then into a religiousness and a god? Because obviously we live in the death of God period. How do you see this?
Yeah, well, I think that the religious question is fundamental to the question of modern being. And I mean, I went to study medieval history only because I was interested in understanding religion, and particularly the conversion. How does a people change the belief system that they orient their entire world around? How did that process happen? That was what fascinated me, and that's what I needed to understand. And that's why I quit my job and took all my savings and went back to uni, spent it all on going back to uni, because I was like, I need to understand this question. And to me, becoming a pagan is completely consistent with my entire worldview. It's like I believe in that the world is full of significance and meaning, and that is evident, its existence is evidence of a creator, but that the biblical story can't match up with anything that's true to me. So as far as I am aware of history in the world, the biblical story is demonstrably not true. Whereas the idea of a multiplicity of truths specific to different peoples, as the pagan philosophers understood it, can be correct, because it's not myths aren't understood as history. They are myths are, although in Irish tradition, myths do explain the history of the Irish, but the myths of the gods are a way for understanding truth rather than facts. And I see humans as being twofold. In the one hand, we are, flesh and blood, and our actions are determined by genetically heritable traits, like, many behavioral traits are now known to be genetically heritable. But also we are a product of culture, and the fundamental overarching structure that governs culture is what we call religion. And even if people say they're atheists, they have a religion in the sense that they have like a binding structure that they unites them with other people who think in the same way, and moral and ethical assumptions about the world. So I would include everything from communism, to Islam, to Christianity, and all these things are religions. So when you're understanding history, because I started off, I wasn't interested in genes. I was just interested in religion. But what I realized is, and especially with the genomic revolution, is that religions don't just spread usually without blood. Historically, religions come in with blood. So, the introduction of Christianity to British Isles, or to Britain at least, not to Ireland, but to Britain, comes from the Roman invasion. The Romans didn't leave a genetic legacy. They had a genetic presence, and then that presence genetically left. But the ideological influence of Christianity survived. Not in England, because the Woden worshippers came and destroyed it for about 200 years. But the Welsh had passed it on to the Irish, and then the Irish brought it back to the Irish monks of the Columban Abbey on Iona, took it to Northumbria, and the Northumbrians influenced back again the Irish culture. So the Irish Celtic Christianity has like elements from Anglo-Saxon artwork in it, with these knotworks, which comes from Scandinavia originally, like this pagan knotwork.
Is that what's behind you?
This is from the Lindisfarne Gospels, produced in England, right? But I bought this in Skye, in the Gaelic-speaking island of Skye, where they had produced it. But it's Lindisfarne, and it's made by monks who would have been converted by the Irish. So the Irish brought Christianity to that region of England, and then the synthesis resulted in the Northumbrians creating this, and then this kind of artwork in their manuscripts, and then that was brought back to Iona, where things like the Book of Kells was probably produced, and then this became the definitive medieval Christian artwork.
Celtic Christianity.
But Celtic Christianity, but it was disseminated by Irish monks who took it from the very Germanic pagans they converted in England, one part of England, whereas the southern part of England was not converted by the Irish; it was converted by the Italians, directly by Rome. But anyway, the point is that religion is understanding religion and why people change their religions. I think is very important to me as much as understanding why population changes happen, because these are the great forces that govern history in the long period over thousands of years, changing ideas, changing blood. So I can't go too much. We haven't got time to go too much into my own religious beliefs, but I've done many other interviews where people ask me about that as well. So I'm sure people can look it up if they want to know.
If you have time for one last question, or if you don't, it's all good as well. You tell me.
I've got to be getting on, actually.
Okay, no problem. We'll leave it on the cliffhanger, my friends. You can take what you got from that. Tom, thank you very much for your time. You gave me a hell of a lot here, and I hope everybody enjoyed. Definitely check out Survive the Jive. And do you have any projects, books, anything like that coming up? Anything to expect?
Well, I've got I've done part 1 and 2 of in the summer this year. I was working on a cruise ship, giving lectures I went to Norway, and that was part 1, which came out this summer. Then part 2, I went to Shetland, and part 3 is coming out, where I go to the Hebrides, and then down to some Gaelic islands. I talk about Gaelic mythology of Ailsa Craig and Finn McCool's influence on the Fingal's Cave, things like that. So it'd be a mixture of talking about. Also, I also go to Orkney, and I look at the oldest Neolithic village, Neolithic village in all of Northern Europe. So if you want a mixture of Gaelic, Viking, and Neolithic history shown on location as I sail around on a cruise ship, and looking at these different places, then look out for that on my channel, Survive the Jive, coming very soon.
Beautiful. Documentary adventurer. There you go. This is what Tom is up to. Thank you very much for your time, sir. I'll wrap it up there. Everybody stay well, and as we said, wait for that. Have a juicy one. Bye-bye, and all that stuff.